l'Université Concordia, et pour ceux qui nous visitent d'ailleurs, bienvenue à Montréal. My name is Cynthia Hammond, and I am chair of the Department of Art History. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I want to begin by acknowledging the spatial and political debt that this event and our entire institution owe to the Mohawk people. We are assembled on unceded territory in the Tiohtià:ke region of that nation. And we are assembled for the keynote lecture of the Art History Graduate Student Association's annual conference, shortly to be delivered by our honored guest, Dr. McKenzie Wark. But before Dr. Wark receives his formal introduction, I've been invited to say a few words. So here they are. Turn off your cell phones. No, seriously, you should turn them off if you haven't already. But those aren't actually my words.
Though we do have some live tweeters.
We have some live tweeters. You're okay. You're a live tweeter. You're all right. You're all right. Everyone else, you're out of here. The irrepressible Fred Allen once said, "A conference is a gathering of people who singly can do nothing, but together can decide that nothing can be done." I'm so glad that happened. I've attended more than one conference that lives down to this description, but the Art History Graduate Student Association's annual conference is not among that number. I happen to have a long association with this annual event. In fact, when I was preparing these notes, I realized that I myself organized this event 20 years ago this month. Yeah. And although I like to say that no one has ever persuaded me to organize a conference again, in fact, the experience of working with my fellow students to showcase their original and exciting research, facilitate dialogue, and discover connections was so outstanding that I do in fact organize student symposia to this day, although I did not organize this one. And the reason that I make this effort has much to do with this year's theme: constellations, clusters, networks. That academics are existentially alone is a well-rehearsed idea. What is less well known, and I think much more vital and interesting, are answers to the questions of how we are together, what facilitates the intersections in our lines of inquiry, builds our heterogeneous chosen communities, and fosters our increasingly interdisciplinary and collaborative practices. So I applaud AGSA for the vision behind this year's event, as well as their innovative approach to the conference format, which I know many of you have already enjoyed. And I think Fred Allen might have to eat his words if he were here. And so on that note, I want to present this year's conference convener, Michael Prou. Michael is an interdisciplinary, posthumanist, ambidextrous homosexual, and he did give me permission to say that. Those are his words. He is also an accomplished artist and cultural researcher of contemporary art and digital visual cultures. As a doctoral candidate in our PhD program, he investigates indigenous media artists' work with the early World Wide Web. He is the 2014-15 Jaroslawski Foundation Doctoral Fellow in Canadian Art History, and he now has the honor of introducing our keynote. Please join me in welcoming Michael Prou.
I didn't think you'd actually use that intro. But thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here. This is nice. It's like a full house. So as Cynthia said, this is the main event for our larger Art History Graduate Student Association annual conference, Constellations, Clusters, Networks. It's a graduate symposium that's brought together emerging scholars from really all around the world for an interdisciplinary exchange on the multiple ideas of networks as they're relevant to currents in art, culture, technology, and history. And so bringing in McKenzie Wark to speak as our keynote address, from his expertise that spans these fields, felt for us the most befitting and fortunate prospect. I want to briefly give attention to some of the support that has made tonight possible. And so firstly, my appreciation extends to my peers in the Art History Graduate Student Association and to the faculty and staff of the Department of Art History and their unending support for projects like this one. We're also supported by the Château Versailles and the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal and the Cross Canada Research Collective Networked Art Histories, assembling contemporary art in Canada the principal investigator, which is Joanne Sloan, who is also the faculty advisor for our conference. And so special thank you to Joanne and to the collective who have made tonight possible. So in thinking of the role of networks in art and culture, McKenzie Wark was perhaps an obvious choice for a keynote address. Such themes are central in his interdisciplinary practice, I think. From the social analyses of the networked cultures of gamers and hackers to now canonical readings of media networks with their vectors of communications, and to historical studies of activist networks of avant-garde artists and effects that they would have on radical art practice in the future. Dr. Wark is known for these pursuits and more, and is professor of culture and media at the Eugene Lang College at the New School for Social Research in New York City. He is the author of many books, including, this is a very truncated list, Telesthesia, Gamer Theory, A Hacker Manifesto, several books about the Situationist International, including The Beach Beneath the Street and The Spectacle of Disintegration, and now the forthcoming Molecular Red, Theory for the Anthropocene, which will be published with Verso next month, and of which we will get a taste this evening, I think. So please join me in welcoming McKenzie Wark.
Thank you, Cynthia and Michael, and thank you for the invitation to come here. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land. It's how we say it in Australia, it's a slightly different word. And I apologize, this is a little writer-centric, because that's what I happen to be working on. And it might take some reverse engineering to make it an art thing, but we can do that conversation later, because I actually don't think that part's hard. All right. So molecular red or systems praxis. I was thinking systems theory. No, let's talk about systems praxis. That might be kind of like a little different. Who could have guessed when the flood came, it would come in slow motion over 40 decades rather than 40 nights. As the polar ice sheets unravel and plunge into the waters, those who have so mismanaged the fate of all things cling to their private arcs. The animals, one by one, will be saved, if at all, as gene sequences. Welcome to the time of the Anthropocene. But let's not lose ourselves to despair or fatalism. It's true enough that this civilization has ended. We live in the ruins, and we know it. This way of life didn't last. What could be more exhilarating project than to create a new civilization? Rome wasn't unbuilt in a day. It will take time. History isn't over. It's barely begun. And where do we find the resources of love, of labor, of language to make another world? As Bogdanov argues, it's a matter of seeing how the past is not just particular pasts, but a past reservoir of potential, of labor, love, language in general, from which it might be possible to select different paths. The time for eloquent footnotes is gone. We need other pasts for other futures. There is no crisis of the humanities. There is rather a problem with humanity itself. Our species being is as builder of worlds, but we forgot how to build them, right when we need to build some other ones. Those of us whose labor and love is language, we have a lot to do. We can show how the past harbors unrealized potentials. Sometimes to make 3 steps forward, one has to take 2 steps back into the archive, that link farm of past potential. We could do with some new stories, new concepts, new affects. The Anthropocene obliges us to rethink both past and future time, and thus also to find the resources in the archive with the potential to interpret those possible temporalities. Which is why in Molecular Red, I went back to a largely forgotten part of the archive. It's a book that tells 2 conceptual and literary stories. So one is about the Soviet Union and the other is about the United States. It's a pair of stories about geographically very big formations whose existence in time has been very brief. And I don't tell the usual Cold War story about them, where one is defeated by the other. Rather, I want to tell a story in which the decline of one prefigures the decline of the other. The Soviet Empire, as such, is gone. The American one is on borrowed time, too. And the problem in both cases is not the relation of an empire to rival forms of social organization. The problem in both cases is the relation of social organization to the nature upon which it depends. If there's a central problem to creating a new civilization, a preliminary way of describing it would be to say, it's about the relation between socially organized labor and nature. Now when I say nature, the term nature has no positive content. Nature here just means that which labor encounters. Let's try to think nature in this limited and formal way for a bit, so as to try to bracket off our assumptions about it. Assumptions which probably come in any case from past ways in which social labor has encountered it. So, back to the archive. I went looking in neglected corners of an archive that I know passably well, which is a kind of Marxist and post-Marxist one. I was raised on Perry Anderson and Martin Jay, Frederick Jamison's construction of a Western Marxism, then on a series of critiques and dissents and détournements of it by feminist, anti-colonialist and post-structuralist writers. Those things all develop, at least in part, out of a creative use of that Marxist archival past. There's a lot of exploring of neglected stacks in the library that went on. Walter Benjamin, for example, was rescued from oblivion by Hannah Arendt, among others. And then it turns out that you guys don't go to the Modern Language Association, but if you you imagine your equivalents in the literary study of literature world, you go to the MLA. MLA has a journal. The most cited author ever in the whole history of MLA is Walter Benjamin. Yeah. So it's like, okay, then so there'll be like a huge cluster on the diagram. So it's, sometimes then you sort of think, okay, that's done. Let's go somewhere else and find another path. So there's one alternative fork in the literature that, with few rare exceptions, was never taken. Nobody had much interest in Alexander Bogdanov. Oh, this is my Marx slide. This guy. In the first decade of the century, he was probably a more influential Bolshevik than Lenin. Lenin forced him out of the party, in part by attacking him on philosophical grounds. Now, there's a famous picture of Lenin playing chess with Bogdanov while Gorky looks on. This version of the photo is one of those creepy ones in which several other people have been erased. Bogdanov won the chess match. And I like to think that's Lenin right at that moment, like, ah! I don't know if that's true, but Bogdanov won. And according to Gorky, Lenin was a bit of a sore loser about it. But then Lenin did manage to checkmate Bogdanov's influence in the Bolshevik faction and have him thrown out. So in the long run, Lenin won and then lost everything. Bogdanov would be remembered in the Soviet Union mainly through the attacks on him in Lenin's, in fact, only book, Materialism and Empirical-Criticism. Bogdanov's fate was in some ways even worse than those that get erased from pictures. He was officially designated as the one who had the wrong philosophy. Mm-hmm. Now this sort of thing always makes me curious. Who was Bogdanov? What was his life and work all about? Not reading Russian, it was hard to find out. Not much is in translation, and almost nothing is still in print. His magnificent utopian novel, Red Star, and there was a sequel, this is that, is available. Fortunately, there's now a resource page for rare out-of-print material in English and French at monoscope.org, and it exists because I PDF'd my own copies of the books and sent them to a friend who got them put up there. But all this stuff's so totally out of print that you know, and in fact, you can't even get it. You need like super user privileges with interlibrary loan to even get any of this stuff. So I put it there. All right, so why Bogdanov? First, there's a revival of the utopian imagination in the light of Marx. He understood the emotional power of a promised land, but unlike Gorky, he was not tempted by what those guys called God building. He was more interested in opening the imaginative faculties to thinking about this world. His utopia, even though set on Mars, is actually practical. Secondly, for prolet cult, Bogdanov initiated a mass movement in 1917 that tried to become a counterpower to the state, but whose mission was proletarian culture. How could people learn to organize themselves and their world? How could literary classics of the past, even Shakespeare, be ways of learning what organization is? Prolet cult was about learning forms of self-organization that can exist outside of capital and state. And at its peak, it had 400,000 members. Some of whom might have come for the heat and free food, but you know, it was a significant mass movement. before the Bolsheviks shut it down. Thirdly, his technology. Oh yeah, and this I think is the most interesting text. It's completely unobtainable, so I had a PDF made out of it. And I had to do it twice, because the first time they destroyed the book. Yeah, and it's like, you know, there are only like 100 of these in existence, and you just destroy one, you know. So yeah, sorry. But I found another one and got a PDF. All right, so the technology. How can all organizational tasks, whether the organizing of labor's relation to nature, or the organizing of different kinds of labor with each other, share and develop knowledge? Bogdanov thought that after the revolution, the real organizational work was actually just starting, and that the real question was labor's relation to nature. There's a sort of really poignant side to this. Bogdanov actually didn't support the Bolshevik October Revolution at all, but even afterwards he was still thinking, you know what, the long-term goal is to have done with class struggle so that we can really figure out labor's relation to nature, which is the real first problem. Now the thing is, we still have classes, we still have inequality, right? We still have to get back to that other problem of labor's relation to nature anyway, even without that other problem being solved. So we don't have the luxury of go, yep, done with class struggle, let's figure out this other bit. It's like, okay, now we've got to do both. We have to figure out both things at once. We're going to have to figure out a new relation between labor and nature, while capitalism, or whatever this mode of production is, still lumbers along, turning everything into a commodity. And just to put it out there, I have a whole other thing about this, but what if this isn't even capitalism anymore, but something worse? Yeah? Like, what if it's something worse? And I think it's worth at least positing that as a potential line of research. Yeah? It turns out not many people have good ways of thinking capitalism historically. Yeah? Ironically, the Marxists seem to think it's eternal and goes on forever. It's like, no, it's all described by value form analysis. So we still have the value form, so therefore it goes on forever. And the neoliberals think it's already solved and already done away with. It's like, but you notice it's neoliberal, so it's back to something in the past. Yeah. So we actually don't really have good historical ways of thinking about it. And most of our timelines are kind of magical. So I just put it out there that what if it's not capitalism, but something worse, and it needs new categories, new descriptions. And indeed, one of the ways one can track what that might be is to follow what artists do. Yeah? As Ezra Pound said, artists are the antennae of society, and it seems to me have good intuitions about whatever the hell this thing is. So, but for now, let's just call it capitalism or something worse. All right, so I think Bogdanov is a useful guide to thinking and organizing otherwise, even in the corners of that. After all, as I try to show in Molecular Red, he almost figured out anthropogenic climate change in his utopia novel in 1908. He's already thinking about climate change. And then in the 20s, he almost gets the carbon cycle right, and he never quite puts the two things together. But it's a really, and we're now going to find out who were all the precursors, who actually knew what the Anthropocene was before the rest of us knew we were in it. And it turns out he's one of them. All right, so he got himself arrested in 1923. So they arrest Bogdanov, and he just says, I refuse to be interrogated by you lot. Call Felix Dzerzhinsky, who ran the whole of the Cheka, like the precursor to the KGB. And they did, like they got Felix, like they got the boss, to whom Bogdanov says, I'm out of politics, I have nothing to do with it, you know, like, just let me go. And so after whatever it was, I think it's like 6 weeks, Dzerzhinsky's like, yeah, okay, we got nothing, off you go. All right, so he withdraws from political work in the 20s. He devotes himself to scientific work, some of which was deeply strange. He kind of thought that if we not only transfused blood but shared it, there would be a kind of socializing of the body. So he's actually a precursor to a certain way of thinking biopower. And he's totally wrong about the blood sharing stuff. But he is actually sort of right that we're all now made out of the sort of technical and medical sharing of body tissues is actually a real thing. And he actually he died in 1928 from blood sharing with a young student who had, I think think it was malaria or something like that, and he just died. But he might have cured Leonard Crassen's anemia with this method, which is why they gave him his own blood research institute. So that stuff's all deeply weird and not real science, yeah? It just wasn't. But he was sort of on the track of something in his own weird way. So he's dead, and the date is significant. It's 1928, which is just when Stalin had consolidated his power. So there is a unprovable hypothesis that his death is kind of intentional and more like a suicide, because he must have known he was done, that he's not going to survive much longer anyway. So, Bogdanov dead in 28. So in Molecular Red, I call upon a second witness to talk about this particular empire, this one that's a precursor to our own, who found a way of writing about the Soviet experiment in building a whole new mode of production, and that's Andrei Platonov. Platonov is now fairly well known as a great modernist writer, but I think he's also a unique theorist in the Marxist tradition. He is that rare thing, a kind of modernist writer with an authentic proletarian background. And his writing is a rare achievement in being almost completely untouched by the bourgeois model of what the novel is actually supposed to be. He came up through Bogdanov's proletariat organization, at least a regional version of it, and after a promising start on a career in journalism and speculative fiction, he quit to retrain as a hydrologist and electrical engineer. He'd witnessed the famine of the early Civil War period firsthand and wanted to do something practical about it. So he worked on land reclamation and agricultural engineering until forced out by some murky bureaucratic wranglings. And then he returned to writing and composed a series of masterpieces. So it's only like how ridiculous Soviet bureaucracy was when he got moved up to an important position that he then goes back to writing because he sort of thought it would be more important to have a career in engineering, and I really respect that about Platonov. Yeah, it was like, oh, priorities, like let's get water and power and things like that to work. I mean, failing that, let's write books and go to conferences. So it's like, oh, so I don't get to be an engineer, I'll write masterpieces instead. That's what he did. So as I read them, his most famous novels, or anti-novels, are a sort of alternative history of the Soviet attempt to create another mode of production that would engage nature in a different way. And it's seen from a point of view that I would call history from below the below. So history from below is from the point of view of working people. But his characters are mostly orphans. They're not even really quite proletarian. They have no land, no community, no family. The etymology of proletariat is those who have nothing but their own family, yeah? And his characters don't even have that. And of course, there are a lot of people like that in the early Soviet Union, yeah? Like a lot of people are orphaned and displaced and so on. So these books are also a profound meditation on what it means to be orphaned in the world. In Chevengur, which is totally out of print, secondhand copies are $400, so I PDF'd it and it's here. Yeah. In Chevengur, he writes of the Civil War and the new economic policy. In Foundation Pit, he writes of Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture, to which he is one of the few writers who is a first-hand witness, because he was seeing what was going on in the countryside as an engineer. Yeah. In Happy Moscow, he writes of the urban elites of the mid-30s, and in Soul, he travels to the far west and produces a powerful allegory of leadership and communal self-determination set within a world of harsh and unforgiving nature. And needless to say, none of these books were published in his lifetime at all. And in fact, that one showed up in the KGB archives. Speaking of archives, yeah, it turns out KGB has got some of the good stuff. I have a friend who does work in Soviet archives, and she tells me she has more than once found Stalin's actual handwriting on documents, which is just the creepiest thing I can possibly imagine. You're there in your little carrel in the archive, and there's Stalin's handwriting. But she did find a complete unpublished manuscript by Lukács. So I don't do that kind of real work, yeah? I'm just going to tell you some stories. So, among other things, Platonov deepens Bogdanov's commitment to thinking and writing from what Bogdanov called the labor point of view, including what's even beneath and what doesn't even quite get included in labor. He writes of the struggle of labour against an impoverished nature, trying to build a foundation on which the exalted superstructures of this new civilization were supposed to be based. He writes about what Sartre calls the practico-inert, the recalcitrant world, partly our own making, that disorganises our labours and reduces us to passivity. As what I find really interesting about this is that the thing that Stalinist ideology and Silicon Valley ideology have in common is a kind of solutionism. Yeah, it's like you just crash through everything. What's kind of really interesting about Platonov is that he's there with the people working on trying to build the foundation, which everything's going to rest, and how impossible that is, how disorganized it is, how impoverished nature is, and how much it doesn't want to give you that. So it strikes me that Platonov is not just a great witness to the Soviet Empire and its inevitable decline, but to our own. I'm using our somewhat broadly to include you, North Americans, in the story. Yeah? So I hope you won't be too offended by that. So in Platonov, there's no leaping over practicalities into the communist future. For him, we can only ever be comrades if we all face the same dangers. And far from being parodies of Soviet speak, which is how his books are often read, the Marxicological language his characters often use is actually, I think, in earnest. He does what Zizek would call over-identifying with the Marxist concepts in order to hold to account a state which can sort of barely mouth them. So in sum, Bogdanov teaches us how to think from a labour point of view about the problems of organising social labour's relation in and against nature. And Platonov teaches us just how resistant and recalcitrant that nature is, how the struggle to organise life can fail, and how it's only when we're all comrades, all facing the same danger, that the struggle has a chance. So that's the first half of Molecular Red. There's impoverished nature. The second half is about California. I kind of wish I was there now. So it's about California in the post-war era. And it's a story not of famine, but of relative plenty. Although these days, it has to be said that behind the fantasy of sun and silicon, we see even more clearly the shortage of water and the plenitude of prisons. So who then are the theorists and writers who help us see beyond the parallel to the socialist realism would be a sort of capitalist realism that we ourselves live in? So who helps us in the way that Platonov does to show us beyond that? And the second half of Molecular Red, I look firstly at Donna Haraway and what she would call her messmates, and then at a science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson. Oops, no, not the next slide. Donna Haraway is an archetypal product of the military entertainment complex at its peak, and on her own account. So the Cold War effort against the Soviets even drew women into the ranks of the scientifically trained. And just as Bogdanov started in medical science before becoming a theorist, she starts in biology. Her first book is on the Organicist school of biology, which has a certain affinity with Bogdanov. She writes there about a fascinating character called Joseph Needham, whose approach drew in part on the systems theory of Ludwig von Bertalanffy, I don't know how you pronounce that, which in turn bears a striking resemblance to Bogdanov's techtology, even though he never cites it. And there's an archival puzzle as to whether Bertalanffy systems theory really actually comes partly, at least, from Bogdanov. Bertalanffy was writing in German, Bogdanov was translated in German, but you can't quite document the link, but it's so similar. All right, so like Bogdanov, Haraway is useful for thinking through the Anthropocene, because she's actually not a social constructivist, even if she's sometimes assimilated into that point of view. For both Bogdanov and Haraway, science at one and the same time produces verifiable knowledge of that alien, inhuman world called nature, yet is also saturated in metaphors imported from existing historical organizations of labor and life. So the difficulties in keeping those two ideas in one's head at the same time and not collapsing back either into that faith in metaphysical realism that's endemic to the worldview of the scientifically trained, or the faith in the sort of metaphysical nominalism and social constructivism that's endemic to the humanities and the social sciences trained. And for those who were humanities or social science trained and who are not yet ready to give up certain ingrained habits of thought, let me put it in tactical terms. The absolutist critique of science is now ideologically a weapon of the far right. It's the far right who denies climate science, surely one of the most important advances in knowledge of the late 20th century. And it would really be a good idea to stop giving climate denialists ideological cover. So a kind of rethinking of our position in relation to that since the 90s strikes me as really tactically very important, even if you're not going to buy the actual argument for why we ought to do it. Because Bogdanov and Haraway are nevertheless proponents of actually a more specific critique within the sciences. In Bogdanov, it has to do with how metaphors from the social organisation of labour find their way into the scientific worldview, even when the science it produces is verifiable. What he calls basic metaphors drawn from authoritarian social relations and market relations both enable but also limit scientific practice. Bogdanov's whole project was to rethink science and labour together as cooperative practices without reducing them to exchange relations. Haraway does something that I think is analogous, also anomalous, but wonderfully analogous here. She famously untangles metaphors of gender, sexuality, and race in the life sciences. What's less well known is her Marxist side. She extends the Marxian category of fetishism from commodity fetishism to what she gives it a few names, but one of them is code fetishism. In our times, the world appears not just as a vast accumulation of commodities or a vast accumulation of spectacles, but also a vast accumulation of codes or algorithms. The algorithm made me do it. As if everything was run by software command. And her whole body of work is pitched against the code fetishism of genetics, for example, and actually in favour of the organicist biology that saw code as an aspect of how bodies are organised, but not as commander. And Needham would here be central of ways of thinking, yes, genetics is an important series of discoveries, but it then starts to be thought on metaphors drawn out of our idea of what a marketplace is, for example. And there are ways to sort of firstly critically analyse the metaphors that are being used, and then back out of that and start thinking other ones. And when Haraway does this, it's strikingly analogous to what Bogdanov was already trying to do nearly a century before. But Haraway also usefully complicates what Bogdanov called the labour point of view, most famously in her Manifesto for Cyborgs. Bogdanov falls prey to a kind of fetishism himself in trying to think labour as if it was not always already entangled in some sort of apparatus. Haraway's cyborg figure is a way of complicating what labour might be, introducing complexities, not just about how bodies are raced and gendered, but how they're woven out of flesh and code and metal and pharmaceuticals, and so much more. The cyborg is all of us. One can't separate living labour from that cyborg mesh. A consequence of this line of thought is that nature is something that can only appear as that which resists labour, including scientific labour, but that labour is always mediated by some kind of apparatus. All of our knowledge is cyborg knowledge. I always think about this whenever I see people, I always work in cafes, and everyone's always got their laptop out. It's like, wow, I'm in a room full of cyborgs, with our devices, all plugged into our networks. In Molecular Red, and Lepmanovich came up in an earlier session. I remember in the acknowledgements of one of Lev's book, he thanks all of the software that he used to write it, which I always think is a magnificent gesture. Anyway, in Molecular Red, I followed this through the work of two people close to Haraway. Karen Barad restates something like Bogdanov's philosophy of science, the era of contemporary physics. And Paul Edwards looks closely at the cyborg apparatus that it took to actually produce climate science. I actually take the ability to say something useful about climate science to be the litmus test for any theory today. So if our theorists don't get why this matters, then get other theorists. Like we just have done with a chunk of literature. And clearly, because many of our favourites from the archives seem to kind of fail that test, given how much of the work of their epigones march on as if the Earth was still flat, or same thing really, was not the object of anthropogenic effects with the capacity to crash it. So Paul Edwards, who is a Haraway student, provides in his book A Vast Machine a really useful reading of climate science as something that arose out of three things. The deployment of an apparatus that was largely military in origin, such as computers and satellites, but which also requires advances in mathematical physics, and perhaps most important, a culture of international scientific collaboration. All right, so it is a kind of systems practice was one of the things that makes it possible. Ironically enough, the kind of self-organized, collaborative love of labor that is scientific and that Bogdanov put such trust in was the very thing that produced this most useful mission-critical knowledge in our time about nature. There's been a revival of interest in things to do with objects and even in materialism of late. But in Molecular Red, I wanted to show why I think some of these are actually kind of missing the mark at the moment. Firstly, any theory that does not get to some notion of the Anthropocene, and call it what you like. Yeah, I'm not wedded to that. Theories that don't get to that quickly and efficiently, yet critically, seem to me not to be doing the job of thinking the times. This is why I find some of the new materialisms of the vibrating, the vital, or the void just a little bit off topic. And secondly, there seems to be a tendency in them to reinstate philosophy as first philosophy, as legislating for what's the matter, as if high theory still had the authority to do such things. And what I find much more useful, oh, there's my pile of matter. I'm supposed to do that when I said matter. What I find much more useful is the kind of what I call low theory of Bogdanov and Haraway, which I think has an interstitial role rather than a dominating one. They're about porting metaphors between labours of knowing, where concepts are selected and tested in each field, or images for that matter, rather than legislating from a centralised philosophical party. They are, in short, a kind of organisational work or a systems praxis. And this, I think, is the task for the theoretically minded today. Not to issue edicts from what we imagine is on high as to the state of the world. Nobody much cares about our pronouncements anyway. Rather, it's to kind of create interstitial communications, to get perceptions, concepts, affects to move between fields, to propose things from one field that might be useful to another. Always bearing in mind that it's not theory that legislates on what is and isn't useful for other fields. Rather, each field of knowledge is its own keeper of the protocols of such decisions. Again, for those for whom this is not theoretically satisfying, consider the matter practically. Nobody is ever going to agree on a particular theory, be it materialist or otherwise. So why hold up the urgent work of building a new civilization for what could be an endless debate about first principles? In any case, for those of us with a more Marxist bent, those sorts of worldviews arise out of praxis anyway, not the other way around. Yeah? So how can we create, systems and practices out of which worldviews are going to arise, rather than trying to agree on first principles in the first place? Like, it seems to me it's the wrong way around. As I was writing this text, I took breaks to waste time on social media. And there on my feed was a story about US Senator James Eichhoff of Oklahoma using a snowball to disprove the science of anthropogenic global warming, as the right have tried to rebrand it. They did focus groups and figured out global warming sounded better than climate change, so they changed what to call it. Yeah? And so you can then disprove the thing that you created a metaphor for by showing that somewhere it's very cold. And in New York lately it's been frickin' freezing. So you're in a kind of a trap of like bad metaphors. Yeah? Oh, and this guy is the chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. It would seem that the United States has some sort of death wish, a fanaticism that wills it towards extinction. I've got to say, it's true of what's going on in Canada and my home country as well. Yeah? Of scientists being muzzled, of not even wanting to take the census. Yeah? Like, you ever hear anything more idiotic in your life to not take the census? It's like, how much business actually depends on the census data? Yeah? It's like, even if you're a pro-business actor in the state, you're shooting your own constituents in the foot by not producing the data. It's insanity. But that's where we are. Yeah? I call it kind of not a fanaticism, but a fanaticism. Yeah? It's a will to death. If hard-won scientific knowledge about nature appears to set limits on the endless commodification of everything, then the sock puppets of the commodifiers will take to their bully pulpits to declare that the earth is flat. So, we're on our own. We have to build a new civilization in the pores of the old one and do it on the quiet. Maybe we could just do our modest bit to try out perceptions, affects, concepts that might be useful. Can we actually perceive what's really on the agenda for history? Can we generate useful ways of feeling about situations and their actual possibilities? Can we organize perception and affect in ways that are useful and open-ended but not too open-ended? Such might be a rudiments of a kind of systems practice, and I think particularly in the university. Yeah? And it's like, you know, no one's going to want to talk about climate change after, because it's like just no fun and it's bad affect. Yeah. So are there ways to actually move on and do things that are useful, where we don't have to like depress ourselves all the time? Are there ways to change agendas for how we do things and do other things in terms of the content, when what we're really doing is building capacity for a much less stable world, which was actually Bogdanov's whole precept. He kind of thought that we took for granted a certain stability in relation to nature. One needed another practice, another education for the moments of instability. And it seems that's exactly how one needs to reorient cultural and educational practice now. Now, while Haraway's work is rich in material from science fiction, and the Manifesto for Cyborgs was intentionally constructed as a political myth, perhaps there's a need for a more extensive practice of imagining other worlds. And my example here is literary, but one could think of this in terms of the arts as well. That's why I end Molecular Red with the work of Kim Stanley Robinson, whose famous Mars trilogy is a sort of self-conscious updating of Bogdanov's Martian Utopia, Red Star. Robinson was actually once a student of Frederick Jameson's, so his novels offer particular delights to those who actually know that literature, but they're aimed at a much wider readership. So you just get your in-joke when you read, it prefers to be called Stan, so you're reading Stan's books. Then he'll do Greener squares straight out of his undergraduate lectures with Jamison, and you go, awesome, I know what that means. Like little in-joke, but they're not really aimed at that insider knowledge. Now, like Bogdanov, Robinson builds a socialist utopia on Mars. What makes it different to Bogdanov, and more of a piece with its times, is that it's more of what I call a meta-utopia. Robinson's task is not to advocate for one organizational form, but to ask how all of the ideas about that might negotiate with one another. He does in utopian fiction something equivalent to what I'm calling low theory, sort of negotiating between different kinds of labor and the kinds of worldview that they generate. Now, I may have lost some people with the mere mention of the word utopia. I don't see utopias as ideal or perfect or imaginary or hopeful or unrealistic. If you want unrealistic, try the bourgeois novel. Yeah, like if you read any of the novels reviewed in the New York Times book review section or its Canadian equivalents, like you go to read them, it's like, what world is this about? You know? Like, it's just surreal, yeah? So I actually find utopia much more realistic compared to that. It's just a question of changing your genre filter. I see utopias as intensely practical, as the practical taken to extremes. Yeah. It's true even of Charles Fourier, who talks about, you know, after utopia is achieved, the seas will turn to lemonade. You know? And it's like, you know what, that would be awesome. And if you think about, there is a sea of lemonade that we've created. Yeah, it's the Coca-Cola company. Like all the things in utopia also come true. Like that's the other thing about it. Like absolutely everything we take for granted in everyday life, there's some utopia in which that was already. You know, Tinder or Grindr as a way of hooking up. It's already in Fourier. Yeah, everything except the technology, that way of organizing social relations. He already thought of it. I could multiply examples. All right, but using the estrangement effect of setting utopia on Mars, Robinson, like Bogdanov, asked practical questions about how to organize labor, including scientific and aesthetic labor, where the production of exchange value does not determine use value anymore. Because if you want a totally unreal fantasy world, it's the one we imagine we're actually in. Yeah? it's already kind of ceased to exist. We're like the coyote in the Roadrunner cartoons who's like just marched off the edge of the cliff, yeah? And it's only when the coyote looks down that he starts to fall, that he knows that, so he doesn't look until the last minute. Well, that's us, yeah? We figure if we don't look, we won't know we're going to fall. And the fall won't start until we look, but we're already falling. Yeah? So let's enjoy the ride down. All right, so the fantasy world of, you know, what's seemingly real, we think we live in, it's not real, and it's already ceased to exist. We just don't know it or want to know it. We're already in the next act of trying to build another world. So my modest proposal is to try to use the university as a place to experiment with forms of collaborative world making with a systems praxis. It does not even have to be about the Anthropocene, that'll just depress us. The Anthropocene shapes the agenda for knowledge, but the agenda need not be obsessively about it. Rather, what resources can we pull from the archive that might usefully contribute to collaborative labour in and against nature, which is not completely dominated by the form of exchange value? What ways can those of us who practice the language arts contribute to the interpretive and translation problems between all of those other kinds of labour that it takes to make the world? Like the hardest thing when you get people from very, very different practices of knowledge together in a room is just to use the same metaphors, yeah? Like half the struggle is about finding language. And the language is never used the same way. It's just agreeing to misinterpret the same things is the first goal. So I think the resources that I was trying to tease out of, there's Mars. It's kind of like the fact that there's only robots on Mars. So in a way, maybe we should keep it like that, because it's kind of off to a good start, yeah? It's like, it should be an exclusively cyborg planet, maybe. So I think the resources I was trying to tease out of the archive in Molecular Red might be just one way of doing this. There's surely others. Even stuff on our standard canonic reading lists might be useful if you read them in different ways, or in this case, looked at them in different ways. Crucial thing is to understand that the agenda for thought is not generated by adding sort of footnote or annotation to the archive as we receive it, but it's a kind of transformative operation on that archive itself. So I shall leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Dr. Wark has agreed to take some questions, and I think we'll use the talking stick because we're recording this. But you won't be recorded, right, Aditi? We won't video them, but your audio will.
Get some art on the screen. There you go. Debbie Squid's passed away last year, I'm sorry to say. I'll leave him there.
Oh, that's really sad. I didn't know that. Okay, well, thank you for an amazing talk. That was really exciting. I didn't understand everything you said, but what I understood I thought was really awesome, so thank you for that. And I want to actually ask you a question about something you said towards the end of your talk. You were kind of, I wish this talk were actually part of our strategic planning process that we're going through right now, which feels most of the time like a relatively empty exercise. But what you've just said really articulates beautifully, I think, what a number of educators and students here are wanting to see, which is the university to be a kind of testing ground for different ways of thinking and acting. And to do this, we need to work across disciplines. We can't remain in our disciplinary silos. This is where we keep ending up, but the entire structure of the university is about this 19th century model of division. Anyhow, so what I really loved in what you said was that what we are doing is building capacity for a far less stable world. And then by doing stuff that cheers us up, even if it's not a direct solution to the problems of climate change, etc. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about how perhaps in your own teaching, or if you've seen examples of this kind of collaborative world making that could be if not a model, then at least a precedent for other ways forward.
Yeah, it's about thinking that it's a question of form rather than content. You know, like it's not about. And I teach a class on climate change. It's called Climate Culture and Design, and it's always under enrolled. Yeah, it's like that doesn't sound like any fun. Whereas I have another one on the goal as media image, It's like, that's always oversubscribed, because it seems like much more fun to be like talking about that figure in popular culture, media and art and so on. So the question would be, how could it actually be the same course in terms of what we're trying to do? But the more interesting problem is how do you prepare people for working in collaborative situations with resource and time constraints. Like that would be the more pressing situation. But the best examples that I've found are either trying to run the Soviet Union in the 1920s, which was a sort of, they partly got that right in the sort of like all hands to the pump sort of side of it, and then also got it completely wrong in this whole paranoid thing of trying to figure out who is the agents of the enemy, and this constant policing of everybody. The other example that's really interesting is wartime collaboration. So how we do collaborative work now, a lot of it comes from the 40s. And it's invented somewhere between Bell Labs and Rad Lab at MIT and things like that. So the sort of stuff that like Google likes to think it invented. Its genealogy really goes back to inventing collaborative practices there that most famously put together scientists and engineers. But also involve people in very, very different fields as well, and that's where it sort of starts to get really interesting. Is some of it's actually not about that, just a hint of a really fascinating example is like, all right, how do you organize D-Day? How do you get tanks up beaches at Normandy? Well, you go ask J.D. Bernal if it's possible, and he will go do research along several lines, but will include visual studies because he'll go through every postcard and photograph that anybody's got of the beaches to try to figure out the angle of the beach and where the hidden rocks are. He'll also do literary studies because he'll dig up a medieval manuscript that talks about there being a causeway that's now been covered in sand. And he'll also do cultural studies ethnographically by talking to fishermen who it turns out have names for all of the rocks. And map studies, because it turns out it's really cheaper when you're copying maps to leave out the little islands. So you go back, the older maps are sometimes more accurate. So this is all stuff he figured out in 1944. So you get tanks up beaches. So there are ways that one could sort of rethink the much more kind of collaborative, open-ended, resource-poor, but very timely approach to doing work in those sorts of situations as the origins of things universities still do, or now major companies still do, but where it's got much, much more kind of formalized and where people are much more covetous of the intellectual property and so on. And to sort of reverse engineer where it came from would I think be the way to get at that. And we try to do it at the New School, but we don't have the sciences, we have design. So it's how do you connect up humanities, social sciences, and design is something that is now a major focus. And it wasn't actually entirely driven by climate, although it's one of the issues that the university is concerned with. It's actually driven by things like if you want to build a city of 5 million people in a space of about 4 years, the design problem includes all those fields of knowledge. And that's a real problem in the 21st century. They build cities bigger than that in our lifetimes, and that's completely unprecedented in the history of the planet.
Others?
Hi, thank you for that really inspiring lecture. I am interested in the notion of the Anthropocene that you, because I wasn't aware of the story of Bogdanov and the blood sharing, which I think is, someone who's fascinated with HIV stigma. I find that really, really interesting. I'm wondering, because your anecdote about having a low enrollment in your climate change class and the, kind of womp-womp success of Naomi Klein's recent book, This Changes Everything, not nearly as glamorous as the shock doctrine or no logo. What is it? There's something so sublime and so abject about what is going on with the environment. I'm wondering, can you think of other literary, particularly literary or cultural precedents of there being a labor encounter with nature moment that so deeply surpasses our collective understanding of our capacities? Because I can't think of one other than, because I stare at the problem all the time, HIV and AIDS, but I can't think of any other ones.
It would actually be kind of fascinating to join Bogdanov to that story, particularly given that it was through deliberately sharing blood that he might have killed himself, but also what his intentions were that were unrealized, and the way that the socializing of blood was he thought like metabolic socialism. But he's actually kind of right about that. And there's a whole, one of the founding texts of the British welfare state is a study by Richard Titmuss on why it's better to use voluntary blood donors than to pay them. And it's a defense of a certain kind of altruism, that people will give blood because they want to, and they want to be part of sharing and community and so on. Whereas if you can sell it, then people often do that for reasons sort of individualized and so forth. And the rate at which you get contaminated blood's higher. So you're much better off with the voluntary system. And this is what Bogdanov was anticipating without even knowing it, kind of thing. And the Soviets build blood banks for civilian use before anybody else does, and it's partly because of Bogdanov. The first institute was named after him. And then because it was okay to talk about his scientific work, as long as you said it was separate from his philosophy. Yeah, his philosophy, obviously wrong, Lenin said so. His scientific work, on the other hand, even though the blood stuff was actually really suspect. So there's a whole history he connects up to a whole history of hematology in weird ways. And his last book, which is deeply strange, was translated by a hematologist who found it fascinating, etc. But yeah, where does one find significant encounters where labour is kind of up against a constitutive limit and has to rethink its practice? And the answer turns out to be over and over again. There's a sense in which that is the history of civilizations. And here I'm thinking this through J.D. Bernal, again, who thought the whole, he wanted to write a history of science, so it goes back to the Neolithic, because that was, and he probably just dictated the whole thing from memory, because he was one of those kind of characters. And someone else fixed all the details and the footnotes and so on. But the way he narrates the story is really kind of interesting, that each of the moments of both technological, social, and cultural change happen at the moment of striking limits. Yeah? I mean, why we're still in this frickin' coal-based extractive, productive system is because in Europe they ran out of wood. It's that simple, yeah? Like the forests were gone that you could usefully exploit. So this more difficult thing where you use coal suddenly gets a lot of attention. And then, the whole geography of economics changes around where there's coal as opposed to where there was timber, So we're at one of those thresholds again. It turns out they're common. It's just we don't usually think in those terms. So I think it's a time to be a really, really, really vulgar Marxist about these things, and to think much less about superstructures and much more about infrastructures, which turn out to be fascinating, not least aesthetically. Yeah? If you approach them in terms of regimes of the visual and so forth, they're fascinating worlds to then go look at.
Thank you, Kim, for a very illuminating talk. And I don't actually have a question quite formulated, but I do have things on my mind. And I know that here, of course, we've been hearing a lot about oil and the tar sands and connecting, and in terms of sort of a global network of these economies that have huge implications on climate change, right? And I'm thinking with the tar sands and the pipeline, that there's something that's being networked in a very insidious way with, of course, China here within the Canadian economy, but also with the Middle East and how that's changing. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts to that with regard to what you were speaking to?
Not that I'm competent to really address, but yes, if one, in terms of stating project, not as something that I actually know, but if one were to just sort of map how changing what resources are crucial, one ends up with very different understandings of the space of the planet, and one now has to kind of think it whole. So, you know, stop the XL pipeline, you know, but there's a whole bunch of other ones already there, yeah? Like, when you then look at, oh, that's the map where the pipelines actually already are, it's like a freaking highway system. It's astonishing, like it's already there. There's a vast infrastructure that to a naive person makes no sense. You know, like, why are we pumping oil halfway across the entire American continent already? It seems like a very strange thing. You know, why is the refinery at the other end? So there are all sorts of geographies that one starts to figure out. Or another one is to do geography of data centers. Yeah, I mean, information is probably sucking up 10% of the energy currently being consumed on the planet as it is. And data centers produce enormous amounts of heat. So they tend to be where there's bodies of water, because you have to cool the damn things. So we sort of think of the information part as kind of weightless, but it's sort of not. It involves vast amounts of energy. It produces vast amounts of heat. It is actually a thing to put data centers up in the Arctic Circle, because the cooling's cheaper. Yeah? Like, that's a thing that people are trying to do. So I think you would have a very interesting kind of idea of what the world is. Yeah? Now, I forget who it is. There's an artist who did really interesting stuff on pipelines in the Middle East to sort of make that visible. Yeah? And there would be a question of what are these worlds that we sort of barely even know exist. Yeah? And how, you know, who imagines that, and who, you know, gives us the perception or the feeling about what those things are. I think be a really interesting set of questions to try to tease out. I mean, I'm from a port city that's probably still the, you know, if not the biggest, one of the world's biggest coal ports, which is Newcastle in Australia. Although the coal is so crappy that Chinese probably don't even want it anymore. So I don't know what the future of it is. But the new open-cut coal mining that's probably just about to get state approval is an area that's 14 times the size of Sydney. Yeah? And you see it from the air, and you see these giant holes in the ground. And because I'm from there, I have this sense of, you know, whenever I see a city, so I flew in and I see Montreal. And so I have this mental image of for every city built up like this, there's a hole in the ground equivalent depth down. Yeah? So it's like, oh, there's holes in the ground somewhere else. But we never see them. We never know where they are. Yeah? There's a sort of fetishism about the world we inhabit. So I think there's things to get at of who actually sort of sees and perceives and understands that. Would be a whole series of questions. Yeah? Alan Seckler's Fish Stories got a little piece of that. Just to pick a random example. It's like, oh, there's little ships and networks.
And I think there's some wine and cheese waiting for us outside. But if there are any burning...
But are they cheese curds?
No. Ken thinks he's never had a cheese curd. He's only in Quebec for like the night, so... Somebody's head would definitely But any last questions? I'd like to take one more if we can. No? Okay, so thank you all for coming. And again, thank you.